Greenland, 1025 AD. 500 farms stretch across sheltered fjords. Stone churches rise from the tundra. Cattle low behind walls built thick enough to outlast cathedrals. This is Europe's most remote outpost. And it is thriving. No one standing in those green pastures knows that within 4 centuries, every single Norse soul on this island will be gone. Not conquered, not memorialized, just erased. When European missionaries finally return in 1721, they will find stone walls still standing, doors still closed, and no one left alive to open them. An entire civilization swallowed by silence. This is the story of how the Vikings built a world at the edge of the earth, and how that edge crumbled beneath them. The name itself was a con. Around 982 AD, a man called Erik the Red, already banished from Norway for killing, then banished from Iceland for killing again, sailed west into open Atlantic water with nothing to lose. He found a coastline carved by fjords, backed by glaciers, but fringed with something unexpected: grass. Deep, wind-sheltered valleys where summer light stretched 20 hours long, and wildflowers pushed through soil that hadn't been grazed in millennia. Erik called it Greenland, not because the whole island was green. 80% of it was buried under ice even then, but because, as the old sagas bluntly admit, he believed more people would go there if it had an attractive name. It worked. By 986, 14 longships had crossed from Iceland, carrying families, livestock, seeds, and iron tools. They established what historians call the Eastern Settlement near the island's southern tip, and later a smaller western settlement roughly 240 miles to the north. Within a generation, the population grew to an estimated 2,000 to 2,500 people spread across hundreds of farms. They built a cathedral at a place called Garda with stained glass imported from Europe and a bronze bell that rang across the fjord. They appointed a bishop. They paid tithes to the Norwegian crown. For anyone watching from the outside, the Norse Greenlanders looked permanent. But permanence in the Arctic is an illusion. For decades, archaeologists assumed the Vikings came to Greenland to farm. Recent excavations have upended that story entirely. At nearly every dig site across both settlements, researchers have found fragments of walrus tusk. Chips of dense maxilla bones scattered through the soil like currency dropped on a trading floor. Thomas McGovern, an archaeologist at Hunter College who has studied Norse Greenland for over 40 years, now describes the settlers not as farmers who hunted on the side, but as commercial ivory hunters who farmed to support their real enterprise. A single boatload of walrus tusks shipped to Bergen, Norway in 1327 was worth more than all the woolen cloth sent by nearly 4,000 Icelandic farms over 6 years. Ivory was their lifeline to Europe, and the walruses lived far to the north, in Disco Bay, 600 miles from the eastern settlement. Every summer, at the height of the growing season, the strongest men sailed north for weeks. They left the farming to others. They left their communities exposed. This arrangement, precarious, brilliant, dependent on both the sea and a distant market, held together for 300 years. Then, in a span of decades, 3 separate forces converged. Each one alone might have been survivable. Together, they were not. The sky. In 1257, a volcano on the Indonesian island of Lombok produced one of the most powerful eruptions of the last 7,000 years. Sulfur particles blasted into the stratosphere reflected sunlight back into space, triggering what climatologists call the onset of the Little Ice Age. Across Greenland, summers shortened, sea ice expanded, the already thin growing season for hay. The single resource that kept cattle alive through winter began to shrink. A 2022 study published in Science Advances analyzed lake sediment cores near the eastern settlement and found something unexpected. Temperatures alone didn't change dramatically, but the land dried out. A prolonged drying trend set in, withering the pastures the Norse depended on. Grass that once grew lush enough to feed herds through winter now barely sustained a fraction of the livestock. Cattle, the ultimate Viking status symbol, became a luxury most farms could no longer afford. The market? While Greenland's climate deteriorated, the world's appetite for walrus ivory was collapsing. Portuguese traders had begun opening routes into sub-Saharan Africa, flooding European markets with elephant ivory. Larger, finer-grained, and easier to carve. Demand for walrus tusks plummeted. The one product the Norse Greenlanders could trade for iron, grain, wine, and timber was suddenly worth a fraction of its former value. As archaeologist Andrew Dugmore of the University of Edinburgh has noted, the fashion for ivory was waning just as competition from a superior product arrived. The Vikings had no substitute. Greenland produced almost nothing else Europe wanted: the plague. Then came the Black Death. There is no evidence the plague itself ever reached Greenland's shores, but it devastated Norway, the Norse Greenlanders' sole trading partner and administrative connection to the wider world. Half of Norway's population perished. The port of Bergen, where Greenland ships had docked for generations, was gutted. Fewer ships sailed, fewer goods arrived. The thread connecting Europe's most remote colony to its lifeline grew thinner and thinner, until it simply wasn't there. The Western settlement vanished first. Sometime in the mid-1300s, it emptied. How exactly remains unclear. Some farms show signs of burning, though whether from conflict with the Inuit, accident, or something else entirely is still debated. Archaeological evidence tells us that abandoned sheep wandered into doorless rooms and grazed on whatever they found. The eastern settlement held on longer. The Norse adapted. Skeletal analysis of 118 individuals shows that their diet shifted dramatically over the centuries. Early settlers drew only 30 to 40% of their food from the sea. By the final decades, that figure had climbed to 80%. They hunted harp seals communally, organizing coastal drives each spring, distributing meat across the settlement. They were careful not to overhunt the vulnerable local harbor seal. They were, by every measure archaeologists can assess, trying. The last written record from Norse Greenland is dated 1408. It documents a wedding at Falsey Church. Sigrid Bjornsdottir married Thorstein Olafsson on a September Sunday. The letters describing the event mention nothing unusual. No desperation, no plea for rescue. Just an ordinary ceremony in what appears to have been an orderly community. Then, nothing. No more letters, no more ships, no more records of any kind. The silence that followed lasted 300 years. When European missionaries arrived in 1721, they found stone walls standing, church gables intact, and not a single living Norse descendant. But they also found something curious in the absence. No valuables, no swords, no crucifixes, no church silver, no jewelry. Save for a single gold ring still encircling the skeletal finger of a bishop buried at Garda, alongside a narwhal tusk staff. Forensic anthropologist Niels Linderup of the University of Copenhagen points out that this pattern suggests departure, not massacre. When you abandon a small settlement, he observes, you take the valuables, you take Christ off his crucifix. At one homestead in the western settlement, known as the Farm Beneath the Sands, archaeologists found every room doorless and fouled by sheep. Except one. That final room still had its door. It was closed. The room behind it was clean. Someone had tidied up, taken what mattered, and pulled the door shut behind them. Whether the last Norse Greenlanders died at sea, starved through one final winter, or quietly boarded ships for Iceland, no one knows for certain. McGovern believes the end was extinction. Linderup suspects a slow, undramatic departure. The truth may lie somewhere between. A community too small to recover from any single catastrophe, bleeding people year after year until the arithmetics of survival no longer worked. The Norse Greenlanders were not foolish. They adapted their diet, they organized communal hunts, they managed fragile ecosystems with surprising restraint. Doug Moore frames their collapse as a warning not about stupidity, but about convergence, climate stress, economic disruption, and pandemic isolation arriving simultaneously. If you consider the world today, he has written, many communities will face exposure to climate change. They'll also face issues of globalization. The really difficult bit is when you have exposure to both. The Norse had exposure to all three, and a population too small to absorb the shock. Sigrid Bjørnsdottir and Thorstein Olafsson. The couple married at Valsey in 1408 eventually made it to Iceland. In 1424, for reasons no one recorded, they needed witnesses to prove their Greenland wedding had actually happened. Those witness letters are the final thread connecting Norse Greenland to written history. After that, there is only stone and grass and wind through an open door. If Norse Greenland teaches us anything, it may be this. A society can do almost everything right. Adapt, innovate, endure. And still not survive the moment when every system it depends on fails at once. If this reshaped something you thought you knew about the Vikings, consider subscribing. There are histories like this one still waiting beneath the ice.